Business 130, Business Ethics, Chapter 7, Anti-Narrative Dialectics Between and Beneath Indigenous Living Story and Western Narratives. So this chapter just goes over all of the terms that we'll be bringing up throughout the rest of the semester regarding storytelling. So, but really, there's just a big difference between Euro-Western storytelling and Indigenous storytelling, and we'll just go over those differences in this chapter. So first, we're going to talk about storytelling. Storytelling is a general term that includes the entanglement of relationships of narrative, living story, and their particular anti-narrative connections and transformations. We'll be going over what anti-narrative is in just a couple minutes. So Western storytelling development separates human life from plant, animal, and planet life. Indigenous ways of knowing are rooted in the connectedness of native science and spiritual ecology. So story is a broad level, all-encompassing term for story fragments and various forms of story of immediate lived experience, of subset of storytelling. So all storytelling is not the same. Hearing an indigenous story told in the traditional way would be difficult to understand if not a cultural insider. Given the changes in modern times, tribal storytellers incorporate more hints as to the meaning of traditional stories in their storytelling. Anti-narrative. So what happens before, beneath, bets on future, the becoming and between the lived experience, and what becomes packaged as narrative, whether BME or nonlinear. So BME means beginning, middle, end. So Indigenous stories are non-linear without a beginning, middle, and end, or at least not in that order. So BME narrative, or beginning, middle, end narrative, a linear plot, which is recognized as an abstraction because it has a beginning, middle, and end, often along with various identifiable plots and characters. So Euro-Western cultures insist on a BME narrative in that particular order. So a living story web is an immediate lived experiences which are swirling around before they have been shaped into plots and abstract themes by acts of narrative. So the living story is a life that was occurring before we made it into a story. Indigenous story is a living story without a clear beginning, middle, end, with non-human characters and without the coherence of plot one expects of a narrative. So Indigenous teaching is essentially rooted in the storied structure and process of storytelling. Story has been a primary way for us to connect different generations. So quantum storytelling, it reflects the interconnectedness of all quanta energy existence in the space-time mattering. Quanta views everything as a form of energy. Although some do not, I see this energy as having a living spirit that centers in its material existence. So Indigenous storytelling carries quite different assumptions of reality from Euro-Western narrative and story. These assumptions include the interconnectedness of all things, the animate nature and spiritual energy of all things, and the need for sustainable communities with high ecological understanding. Fractals, repeating patterns of self-sameness across various scales of magnifications which may appear in stories or narratives. So examples of these fractals might be cycles of plant life or seasons or cosmic movements. Animism of vitalism. Animism is considered by Western science to be anthropomorphism, but in indigenous wisdom, the mountains, rivers, rocks, and fire, all the elements of nature, including every plant and animal having living energy. Vitalism, on the other hand, in quantum materialism, has the quanta, the living energy, of waves that can collapse into particle formations. Things tell a story. Things have vitalism. There cannot be a separation between humanity, spirituality, nature, sociality, and materiality. Space-time mattering. A term by Barad is the inseparability, the very entanglement of space-time and mattering. I use it to look at how storytelling is spatializing, temporalizing, and mattering in existential ways. Space mattering describes a sense of entanglement between human and nature environment in quantum storytelling. We've already talked about this a little bit, but IWOK is indigenous ways of knowing. So Khajiit suggests 4 steps to preserve and revitalize indigenous storytelling ways. So the first step is go to the source of the stories, the place of the stories, and the place of the people storying. Number 2, build storying muscles by exercising the creative process of storytelling. Number 3, apply story lessons to living story, to living one's own story. And then number 4, the survival of the community or tribe means resisting colonization of indigenous ways of knowing. Spiritual ecology is a concept by Khajiit that refers to the spirits of the world of which we are a part, and from the quanta to the cosmos to the ways of living energy. So spiritual ecology deals with the relation of the spirits of the world to one another and to their physical surroundings. So now we can compare the storytelling genres between Euro-Western native or narrative and indigenous and living story. So we're going to look closer at how indigenous and living story differs to Euro-Western narratives. First, they differ in structure. Excuse me. The Euro-Western narrative always has a beginning, middle, and end. Maybe linear or cyclic. Indigenous and living story without beginning or end. In the middle, spiral or rhizomatic assemblages. Next, there's time orientation. So in the Euro-Western narrative, time is subjective. It focuses on an unchanging view of the past. Indigenous and living story, the time folds on itself. Present oriented with back shadows of the past as the past mixes with present to provide lessons for the future. Place orientation. So the Euro-Western narrative it is incidental and usually not important to the plot or is an abstraction. Indigenous and living story, places of central importance. It provides context and materiality and holds the story. The characters differ as well. In the Euro-Western narrative, the characters are human and restricted to participants in the plot. An indigenous and living story includes humans, non-humans, and material objects as active participants, whether living, non-living, or deceased, all in changing webs of relationships. The plots differ as well. The Euro-Western narrative has a problem to solve or a question to answer or a mystery to resolve. Indigenous and Living Story is dynamic being and becoming, revolves around relationships more than issues, plots, and problems, highlights questions and not answers. And then last, we have the past, present, or future orientation. So the Euro-Western narrative is retrospective, and then the Indigenous and Living Story, both in the moment and long-term, through the generations, both retrospective and prospective. And that is the end of Chapter 7.